Welcome to the Bad Boss Brief. I am Stephanie Peirolo.
And I'm Eugene S. Robinson.
And we are at episode 54, and we are calling this Karma
Studio
is
54.
a Bitch. Studio 54. Yeah, we're calling this Karma is a Bitch.
Yeah.
And we're going to talk about karma, not in a religious or spiritual sense, but that thing when someone who is difficult or wicked appears to get away with their wickedness. And that moment when time passes, the worm turns, and they don't. They have to pay. And of course, in this show, we are going to talk about the stunning reversal that had Eugene and I texting furiously last week, where Trump pardoned convicted felon Carlos Watson as he was scheduled to show up to start his 10-year prison term, and also wiped out the $98 million fine. So of course, you know that we're going to talk about that. But before we get started on that, Eugene, do you have any good karma stories from your work life?
Oh, dozens. The one, my favorite one is a cat that I worked with at Apple named Jim. And Jim was one of these big company guys who thought that maneuvering was a way to get yourself ahead. So they had brought me in as this wunderkind who was going to do what four other people had failed to do. And that was turn apple.com into like a destination site, right? This is when people still thought companies could do cool things with their websites. And I'd gone off on a business trip to Zurich. They'd flown me to Zurich. And that's when he struck. He sent some snarky, minimizing, diminishing email, and then ended with the faint. But I guess we could talk about this when Eugene gets back. Like I had gone off on some pleasure jaunt and not a work-related thing that he had sort of been involved in helping send me on. And of course, I read this right as I got back to my very nice hotel room in Zurich. And I said, I shouldn't read emails, shouldn't read work emails before going to bed, but I'm going to do it. And of course, I flipped out because, and instead of sleeping that night like I should have, wrote a series of responses that just, and now I realize how aggressive they were in terms of Silicon Valley, in terms of California speak, but I didn't like it. I thought it was their dirty pool, and I called it out as such. And of course, my alarm was scheduled to ring at 7, and I finished writing at 6:58. And in disgust, I jumped in bed for 2 minutes just to say I had used it. But I set him straight. He eventually ended up leaving, not as a result of this, leaving Apple and going to Cisco, where he very much tried to do the same kind of, sleazy guy maneuvering. Cisco caught on, out, no tolerance, got him in under 30 days. I mean, I don't think he lasted 30 days there. So in my mind, that was karmic leveling of the highest order.
And I have seen that a lot. Bad bosses who kind of streak through the sky like a meteor and then disappear well before their kind of due by date. But
what was most upsetting about this guy was he was not a boss. He was a dotted line who had aspirations to be the boss. And that's what part of what he was doing when he was trying to own me in this regard.
Well, my karma story was actually the woman who was my supervisor. So this was years ago. I was a vice president of an ad agency. And, as many of you know, my son was in a car accident. He was in a coma. And there were months where I was fighting with United Healthcare, who provided the company's insurance, and trying to get him care, trying to get him into, the rehab facilities that he needed. And I thought that this woman, I'll just call her Jane, would be supportive because she was also a single mom who also had a son. And I assumed there would be some fellow feeling, some sense of whatever. And I was mistaken. And she made an already difficult situation much worse. And one of the she did a lot of things, but one of the most emblematic was I finally was able to get my son into brain injury rehab, but I couldn't get him at a hospital in Seattle. I had to take him to Denver, Colorado, to Denver Children's Hospital. And so I have a kid who's in the hospital in Colorado, and I have a kid who's in school in Seattle, and I'm flying back and forth, and I don't have any more leave left. So I'm working from the hospital. And at the time, I was a smoker. And so I would go outside in the parking lot in Denver in the winter and work on my laptop and smoke.
Mm-hmm.
Now, needless to say, I was pretty succinct in my internal communications. And I had a woman who was my assistant, kind of, admin, who I knew well, liked, and I would send her very, quick, like, here's 17 things that we need to get done. Let me quickly write this before, I freeze.
Yep.
And when I got back from one of those trips, Jane took me aside and chastised me for having internal emails that were too curt. And that I evidently needed to lard my emails with exclamation points and how was your weekend and thanks so much. And I said to her, I'm writing this from a hospital, right? Now, there was no concern about the client emails. Like the clients were happy, that part of the work was done, but she just didn't think that I made nice enough to my admin. And so I finally filed for FMLA leave, so I didn't have to do that anymore. And then they fired me, which is illegal when you have taken FMLA leave. So a few years pass, my son dies, I get a job, I'm, at another ad agency. And my boss says, who's the president of the company, says, I got this resume from this woman that you used to work with for a very senior, very well compensated position. So did you know Jane when you worked at that agency? And I said, yes, I did. Yeah. And he said, should I bring her in for an interview? And I said, no. That was it.
That's delicious.
Isn't it delicious? I didn't say another word. And, he's a great guy. He knew me. He just kind of looked and was like, okay, then not bringing her in. And what I really like about that is that I don't feel like that was revenge. I feel like that was allowing her to savor the consequences of her choices.
I like the way that was put as well. Yeah, I've had a few of those. And one guy who had robbed me, I got his resume. And this is back when I was not going to hold fire on something like this. And I said, so funny. I wrote him, so funny. I should get your resume now after you robbed me several years ago. Do you remember that? He had published a magazine. And I was publishing a magazine. We had an intermediary, and he said, you know what? You guys should exchange mailing lists, right? These were the days before the internet. So this was a big deal. So I printed out like 30 pages of, these were hard leads. People who had actively bought stuff from me. And he said, and he who had a larger magazine wrote back after getting my 30 pages. He's like, yeah, I don't think I'm going to, that's something I feel comfortable doing, I guess. And so when his resume came through, I reminded him of that and said, you know what? You'll get a job here when hell freezes over. It's a character issue. I'm sure you'll understand. Right. Never heard from him again. But again, I love that idea of, yes, the consequences of your actions. You get to live with them now. Perfect.
Right. Well, and I think too, recognizing it's a good watch out for everybody. Right. Particularly people who are younger in their careers, or they think maybe, I live in New York or Los Angeles. I'm never going to see this person again. You would be surprised. And I do think that certain industries, like I've been in advertising for a long time, it is really a small town. Everybody knows somebody who knows somebody, and that word gets around, right? Word gets around about the people who lie about things, who treat people badly. And so that's, I have watched this now that, at our age, I've watched this happen many, many times. That there comes that moment where somebody thinks that they're going to be on the upswing their entire career, and then they need a favor, they need a help, they need a hand, and everybody's like, yeah, where were you?
Yeah. No, it's, I mean, and he got the nice send off. I had a manager throw a phone book at me, and I did refuse to work for her from that moment on. But then years later, her resume comes across my desk as well. And this time she called she called me, and rather than just let her, I did what I call the Sicilian model, which is so great to get this. Could you send me a few more things, like some references so I can get this through the system? Yeah, you're laughing because you know where this goes. Yeah, I had no intention of helping her get a job at all. I just kept it going until she figured it out. So,
Yeah. Wow. Well, the reason that I was thinking about karma is a bitch is
yeah,
because sometimes it is reassuring to me when I see someone who profits from their wickedness and appears to have no consequences. And the reason that this came to mind was because of Carlos. So, Eugene, do you want to talk a little bit about kind of what happened with Carlos and what we think about that?
yeah. Carlos Watson was the CEO, and founder, co-founder of Aussie Media, and which all came crumbling down on the occasion of an article Ben Smith wrote, where they said that they used a voice-changing device in a financing call with Goldman Sachs and YouTube to impersonate an executive, but this was just the tip of a much more significant grifting iceberg. And it went on with Watson proclaiming his innocence. And then the FBI arrested him in New York, Eastern District of New York. They put him on trial. It was an 8-week trial, which he and his legal team bobbled badly. In discovery, they were not turning in documents. I mean, every junior league mistake that you could make, which is strange given that he himself is a Stanford educated lawyer and had a pretty senior team it almost seemed purposeful. So they convict him, a jury of 12, and he was up for sentencing because he had been such a bad actor in court and perjured himself so many times. They remanded him to custody initially. He was 30 days at the MDC in New York, the Brooklyn House of Detention in New York, which was apparently pretty miserable for him. He gets out, then they basically put me in solitary or home arrest. They gave him a home arrest. And then they came up with financial forfeiture and restitution, $96 million, and 9 years and 8 months in prison, which, interestingly enough, is the same amount of time I worked for this guy who I can comfortably call a monster, a really bad actor. And then he starts peppering the judge, saying the judge is playing the stock market. The Jewish judge is playing the stock market like a dreidel. He becomes super black man. He's like, this is racism. This is a high tech lynching, and the Clarence Thomas playbook. And then he starts putting up pictures of himself and Trump, which I thought was a weird change. And then the day before April Fool's Day, I believe, or Friday, the 28th, so a couple of days before April Fool's Day, when he was scheduled to get sentenced, they were flying him to Lompoc prison, and his sentence was commuted. So he's still a convicted felon, but he doesn't have to go to prison for 9 years and 8 months, nor does he have to pay $96 million, which is a very strange turn of events because his co-defendants, who turned state's evidence, still haven't gotten to the penalty. They gave him time served, which is pretty much fingerprinted, photographed, and processed, but they haven't got the fine portion. So conceivably, the two younger employees that he had led through this whole thing might end up paying financial restitution and forfeiture for a guy who just got off scot-free. And of course, there are not many avenues. Some of the board members I've talked to said, well, who's going to trust him now? His name is probably mud in Silicon Valley, but somebody sagely said, well, the only place, the smart move for him now is into politics. And if you read some of what he's written since then, it seems like indeed that might be the way he chooses to go. I mean, that's the only play that makes sense for him. And it's a way for him to transactionally pay back whatever it was that went between him and Trump. And it was via Alice, the woman in charge of the who's been exonerated, who herself was exonerated and now is leading this commission to exonerate people who were falsely convicted. But in this instance, nobody believes that Carlos Watson was falsely convicted. So he was, apparently, once again, the Clarence Thomas tact worked, and he is now a free man, not on probation, not anything. Could he immediately go on to reoffend? Almost immediately, I'm guessing he could go on to reoffend. So that's where we are. And of course, this continued. Eric Adams was not for, on corruption charges. Those have been dropped. And they gave it the double indemnity thing so that Trump can't use it as leverage over him. So he's like nothing happened. So I have a busy schedule today of bank robbing. So since I found that's not illegal either. So, stay tuned.
But how does, and again, to be clear, I also worked at Ozzy briefly.
Mhm.
You brought me in for a what turned out to be a short stint. But we both had experience with that particular bad boss. So when it comes to this idea of karma, like
Mhm.
how do you process what happened, having worked there, having, having your clear opinions about his culpability? What do you do
Well,
with that information?
some MAGA folks, I came in, these MAGA people I train with, jujitsu, and they were like, "What are you so good?" And said what I just said, and they were like, "What do you care?" And I go, well, "That's an interesting take." They said, "You don't have to work for the guy anymore. What do you care how?" And it wasn't until, and I carried that in my head until I met with my ex-wife later on that day, and I said to her what they had said, and she had responded with, she's a lawyer. She said, "Look, we have standards. Laws are based on standards. This is a country of laws. And if you upend those standards, you are in crazy town." And I think that was a pretty sage take on where we are. We're in crazy town where laws don't apparently are not to be followed by everybody. There was nothing. They said, "Oh, we couldn't present all of our evidence." You were asked repeatedly to present your evidence, and you didn't. You didn't. You didn't. You didn't submit. Where is this evidence? So now it's become something. Oh, we were prevented from doing. No, you weren't prevented. And he's like, "Oh, the judge has stocks in these companies. If you have a 401k, you have stocks in hundreds of companies. It doesn't mean it's a conflict of interest." So every single avenue that they tried to do didn't work. But the magic trick, the magic card was the Trump thing, and it worked. I'm sure they reached out to Biden's folks as well, because Jill Biden participated in one of the early Ozzy Fest, and Joe was there as well. I mean, I've met him face to face and hung out with him before. So I'm sure Carlos would have very definitely gone to Biden, but he did not. And it was Trump who actually affected his release. So it makes me feel. I mean, my goal is, it helped talking to my ex-wife, and my goal was always to, like a kind of weird Diogenes. I am. My job now is to continue to tell the truth, as long as he puts me in a position where I need to do so. And if he intends to maintain a public life, like Tom Joad said, and Grapes of Wrath, I'll be there. So that's how I'm making sense of it. I am the instrument of karma, which sounds kind of crazy and delusional, but in this instance, probably right.
But I do think that there is a value to naming reality, right? I
Yep.
mean, I talk about this all the time. I write about this, that just saying this is actually what happened. You don't get to erase this, right?
Right.
Like Donald Trump has been convicted of felonies and is as they say, an adjudicated rapist.
Yep.
I would just continue to repeat that as often as necessary.
Yep.
Like Carlos was convicted. He did lead multiple frauds. And I think that there is a value to naming it, because I think also that idea of like, I like what you were saying that your ex-wife was talking about, and kind of the rule of law
Yep.
is that, the really, in my Substack last week, I wrote about an article that I saw in the New York Times from a small law firm
Yep.
that was kind of doing an exhortation to other people who are involved, like lawyers and judges, saying, you took an oath. And there was a great line in there that it will be a judge who decides whether or not Trump is a president or a king.
Yep. Yep.
And
Yep.
really looking at like it may be that branch of government that is the only thing that stands between us and authoritarian rule. And so really having an idea of like reframing that is when the judicial system is attacked, whether it's talking about impeaching judges or letting people who have already been convicted go free. And of course, the executive does have the power of the pardon. Right. And it just is a little bit disappointing that that's used to pardon, wealthy grifters.
Well, but it's deeper and darker than that even, because if you think the Romanians released the Tate brothers, sex traffickers and rapists of note, the Tate and part of this manosphere, if you think that the Romanians released them because they wanted to, you're wrong. They released him because there was pressure from the Trump administration, because indeed they show up in the Oval Office. Not only do they show up in the Oval Office, but they show up at the next UFC, Ultimate Fighting Championship event, where they're hugging Dana White and they're hugging Trump, and it's a grip and grin and a photo op. And he's reoffended.
Mm-hmm.
His girlfriend, who was having consensual sex with him, said they got to the point where during the sex act, the verbal and physical and emotional abuse was so great, she had to say, look, just stop. She was crying, sobbing. He didn't stop. And he refused to stop. And she left, went to the police, went to the hospital, got her bruises photographed. And instantaneously, the response is, as you would expect from the administration that we're in, he's got the playbook down. He was like, it's just a cash grab. She's just after my money. This never happened. It's fake news. It lies. And that's the playbook from now on. And what judiciary is going to pick up this case? Who's going to go through what district attorney is going to pursue the Tate brothers now, since he's been given, kiss the ring, and has now been given a get out of jail free card. And like Dirty Harry said, how do you know he's going to do it again? Because he likes it. I'm quite sure Carlos is going to regrift and the Tate brothers. And in the same week, he had Conor McGregor, who was also found guilty of rape in the White House and the Oval Office, where he announced his run for the presidency of Ireland,
Trump has been found guilty of rape as well. And it's interesting because I just found, before we started recording, a article that I wanted to bring to you as a Fire Me, and it is about Dana White. So in Adweek, and there's an article in Adweek by Mark, looks like Chiro is his name. Anyway, he wrote that there's a big deal between Meta and UFC.
Yep.
And there's a picture of a smiling Zuckerberg with his arm around a smiling Dana White. Turns out Dana White is now on the board of Meta.
Yes. Yeah.
It's starting in January. And what was interesting to me is that I went back, and we've talked about this on the show before, in New Year's Eve 2023.
Oh, you mean when he beat up his wife on video? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
He is a fighter. And
he's not so much a fighter as he is a promoter.
But he is a large man.
Yeah.
And in this video, his wife slapped him, and he slapped her twice and knocked her to the ground.
And kicked her.
No, jeez.
You gotta watch the full video. He kicked her. Yeah.
And and I went back and looked at some coverage that happened in January 2023, and he's quoted in a New York Post article. People were saying, well, are you going to step down? And he said, why should he step down? Because he has to live with the burden of knowing that he did this for the rest of his life, and it would harm his employees if he had to step down.
His employees, he aggressively underpays, but yeah.
Yeah. And so the idea that he said something to the effect of like, I'm going to have to live with this for the rest of my life. People are always going to know I was the person that did this. Mm. But being the person who did this apparently does not preclude him from, flying pretty high, at least at this point.
Yep. Oh, you mean the $36 million beach house and that stuff? Yeah.
Well, and it didn't even say in the article how much money he is getting from this Meta co-promotion.
And in the Substack, it's like Trump is trying to put together an Avenger team of grifters, as somebody said in the comments. But on the Substack, I make the point that I think or one of the people I interviewed made the point that he's surrounding himself with grifters. So it makes it seem like, that this is an epidemic of people unjustifiably being charged with stuff. And it's like, come on. No. That's not the way it works. But apparently it is working. So.
Well, and one of the things that I think about with this idea of karma and why it's reassuring to me and how I've kind of used it is to think about it in two ways. One, these people who are doing this horrific stuff, they may be experiencing consequences of their choices that we don't get to see. Right. It's easy to think about someone who has, no legal repercussions for domestic violence, who has a $36 million beach house, who's posing with Zuckerberg and, hanging out with Trump as having some things that are of value, not to me, but, we could see like, oh, wow, those things look impressive. But I always think about like, what's it like for that person, right? Like, the notion that like, I have none of those things. And I have, a family that loves me, long standing, very
Yeah.
supportive friendships. I have self-respect. I, like whatever happens when I meet my maker, I'm not super concerned about it. There's so many things in my life that are a result of having tried to be a decent person. And these individuals, I imagine, have none of those things.
That's the thing. I mean, ultimately, I was brushing my teeth that Friday night and I was thinking, you know what? I would still rather be me. I would still. So this is not marked by envy or jealousy. I would 100 times out of 100 would still rather be me.
Right.
$36 million beach house is kind of nice, but the trade off, no way. No,
Yeah.
I'm very. I mean, that was a statement more about the size of my ego, maybe, but I have no interest in being Dana White or Carlos Watson.
Right. And you think about the very things that cause those people to, be frustrating to us. Imagine the impact on their loved ones. Imagine being married to someone who is a convicted rapist. Imagine being, the child of someone. I mean, Elon Musk doesn't seem to get along very well with his kids who have.
You mean the kids that he conceived through IVF? Those kids,
Yeah.
as he tried to portray himself as an international stud, but in actual fact, people just had test tubes and turkey.
But aren't all of his kids conceived that way?
Like a vast majority of them. Yeah.
I mean, but and that is something that is ultimately sort of comforting to me. This notion that these people may seem to be reaping rewards, but internally they are empty shells, husks of humans, and maybe some of them are not. But that I do kind of take some comfort in the idea that you can't treat people that badly for that long and have friends. You can have people around you. You can have an entourage. I mean, when you talk about Trump wanting to be surrounded by grifters, I immediately think of alcoholics who, as their alcoholism gets worse, they start to they change friends because they want to hang out with people who drink like them.
Right.
Which means you change until everybody around you drinks like you, so you don't feel as bad about your drinking.
Well, also there's this thing I've started to call the Barabbas paradox, because apparently my Bible knowledge was scant. I knew Barabbas, but I didn't know that he was a bad guy. I just generally is a thief, and I just thought of something, but he was a murdering, raping thief. And so I was like, whoa. And so I got this image of, saying Pontius saying, we got Barabbas. You should, nah. And then Barabbas, this had to be the greatest day of his life, where he was like, they set him free, and they set him free. And then you could kind of see Barabbas go, can't believe I beat the system. Now, where was I? Oh, yeah. Stabbing and robbing and raping, everything again. And I think that's the nature of these people. We saw it with O.J. Simpson. We saw it with they can't, or like Dante said, the people in hell, in the inferno, are just doing what they did in life, but they're doing it after life, right? So the greedy are still, except they're being helped to be, consuming massive amounts of flames or whatever such thing. So I think, being them is the price that they have to pay. And I'm sure in a certain degree, Dana White would say, I'm pretty happy being me. And I said, I'm sure you are. And therein is a problem. Right?
Well, and that's one of the things that I keep coming back to, and talking to friends who work with or in the federal government and just, trying to keep some sort of mental health and balance right now, looking at the news. And one of the things that I've really found to be helpful is to lean into community. Whether it's my, hanging out with my family or friends or in, the multiple communities that I have, because I think that's where there's this sense of groundedness and connection. And that, when you say that there isn't anybody that's going to persecute, anybody in Trump's circle that rapes someone, you know what? I think that there might be. And I like to think that the prosecutor or the DA who's going to go after the Tate brothers probably has a family. They have a community. They have people that they can lean into who are going to say like, yes, we're going to take this risk,
Yep.
and I think that notion that, together we can not just affect change, but we can support one another to do the brave and necessary acts of resistance that will hopefully save us.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, that's that the good will make right this evil wrong. That's the only hope. That is the only hope.
Okay. On that note, if you have any ideas for upcoming podcasts or questions or things you would like us to help you with, please get in touch. It's WTF@badbossbrief.com. WTF@badbossbrief.com. I will read and respond to everybody that isn't trying to sell me something. And we will see you in a couple of weeks. Thanks. Bye.
Adios.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Bad Boss Brief podcast with your hosts, Eugene S. Robinson and Stephanie Peirolo. You can check out more of their work by visiting consigliera.substack.com for Stephanie and eugenesrobinson.substack.com for Eugene. You can also find Eugene at Mr. Sleek 3, that's number 3, on Instagram. Reach out with your questions, concerns, worst case situations, or suggestions to us at WTF@badbossbrief.com. We personally answer every submission. Be sure to join us at badbossbrief.substack.com every other Wednesday for episodes of Bad Boss Brief so you can gain further insights into your workplace environments. Until next time, don't be an asshole at work.